Today we're going to be talking about fuel timing and just in general what we should be having pre and post workout. So, why does fuel timing nutrition matter? Well, a huge aspect of performance nutrition is not only what we eat, it's when we eat. And so that's why, I really want to take today's session to really dive in about, fuel timing and what we need to do um, throughout. And when done correctly, proper fuel timing will really drastically support your energy, your focus, recovery, and will really reduce your risk of injury. So first and foremost, the goal of training is of course to maximize your training outcomes. And we often assume that the harder and better we train, the better our outcomes will be. However, if we don't fuel to support these outcomes, you really may actually hinder your overall performance. So fuel timing can help maintain this energy levels and prevent those energy crashes either at the end of a workout or even during the workout, which is obviously not ideal. So, fueling and refueling at given times will also support your muscle recovery, ultimately allowing you to continue training well for the coming days. So, if you have back to back days where you're consistently training, but by day two, you didn't fuel properly, and you're not, and you're sore, you're not energized, that will really obviously then affect your upcoming training days. And so ultimately, the worst thing we can do for ourselves, especially at the start of the season or off season, is to not fuel well. So we want to make it to playoffs. We want to, make it through the whole season. So we don't want to, um, go get into that time completely burnt out or underfueled. We want to perform, just as well at the beginning, if not better by the end of the season when, it's really counting. So sustaining your energy and nutrition throughout the season is, just as important as keeping up, your training skills, techniques, plays, practices, all those things. So we like to split fuel timing into three main buckets. So we have pre-workout, mid-workout, and post-workout. And each bucket has its own kind of goals and things we should focus on in the sense of how to fuel and what to fuel with. So pre-workout is really kind of the goal is to top off your fueling stores for long-lasting energy to get yourself ready for that training, that game, that workout, etc. Mid-workout is maintaining energy and your hydration to kind of keep that, longevity of your workout or game keep going. And then post is of course to replenish your fuel stores and then start that recovery process. So before getting into fueling, timing specifics, I'm going to, briefly review what your needed fuel sources are. This is your fuel team. And I'm really going to be kind of hammering these three macronutrients throughout the summer session. So, just so it gets really ingrained in what they are and why they're important. So it's important to remember that carbs, fat, and protein are all critical aspects of the fueling plan. And, they each play a different role in the body, just like, different positions on the field have different functions. You need every position on the field there ready to play in order to be successful. And the same principles apply to macronutrients. So, once again, as a reminder from previous sessions, carbs are our main source of fuel, glucose, um, for our muscles, brain, and central nervous system. It is the largest amount of this glucose is housed in our muscles, called glycogen, and carbohydrates are needed to provide adequate fuel for that, muscle tank. And then um, protein builds and repairs structures in the body, specifically muscle, but a lot of other, cells and structures as well. It's a great team player when there aren't enough carbs on board. It will sacrifice its energy, demands to be able to utilize for energy, but that means it just can't do its full job with repair and recovery when there aren't enough carbs on board. And then fats, thirdly, can act as a fuel source for that long duration, low intensity endurance exercise. So think, long, slow runs or, sustained practices back to back, etc. So it's, critical for that vitamin absorption, stabilizing your blood sugar, all those things. So to kind of give a basic overview of fuel timing, once we know what bucket we're in, so pre, mid, or post, we can talk about things more specifically around timing. So this is just kind of an example of, those different buckets and even how those buckets then further break down into, smaller increments of timing. So as a general rule, the closer you are to that training session, the easier your should be to digest. We don't want something heavy and sitting in our stomach. While we're training, obviously that's going to slow us down, cause cramping, all those things. So kind of remember if it's easier to chew, typically it can be easier to digest. Um, so we want to, for carbohydrates in the sense of pre-workout, we typically save or want to prioritize whole grains for, 3 to 4 hours before our competition or training or game. And then also too after training for that refueling meal. And when we're a little bit closer to training, say 60 minutes or less, that's when we want to prioritize things like those simple carbohydrates, crackers, applesauce, sports drinks, pretzels, and because you have a little bit less time to digest them. But again, those things are easier to digest and more efficiently utilized by our body as energy. And then fat and protein, we're going to want to, again, prioritize those a little bit farther away from training in that pre workout bucket. Because, we digest fat and protein a little bit slower, stays in our stomach a little bit longer. So it will give us that prolonged energy that we need to fuel our training, but may not be the most effective thing, less than 60 minutes before, because our body won't have either digested or being able to manipulate it into energy just quite yet. Okay, so further into the bucket, so pre-workout fueling. I'm gonna get pretty, relatively granular with each of these timing buckets. They all have their own nuances that we want to remember, and um, it is our main focus topic for the day. So our overarching pre-workout goal is to fuel, not necessarily fill. So we want to top off our glycogen stores prior to training to, make sure that we have the most abundant and adequate amount of energy available to be used during the game, the training, the workout. So let's look at some examples. So 3 to 4 hours before should be your pregame meal. So that's where we want to utilize that performance plate diagram. Half carbs, quarter protein, quarter color, making sure we're hydrating and getting that, topping of fat so that, we have a little bit more sustained fullness. We also never really want to try a new food. I'll just kind of say this off to the side. Try a new food on a game day. I always like to say that because you never know. It could lead to stomach upset, or if you don't like the food because you've never had it before, that might ultimately lead to underfueling and again underperforming. So then when we get to kind of 1 to 2 hours before, where it's not right before the game, but you still have some time for your body to digest, that's going to be kind of like a large snack slash small meal. So this is really where you're going to want to focus on simple carbohydrates, but also maybe a small amount of protein, maybe a little bit of fat. 60 minutes before, again, this is going to be primarily 100% simple carbohydrates. We don't want protein, we don't want fiber, especially, and we don't want any fat because, again, those are the slower digested macronutrients that, when eaten less than an hour before the training, is not really going to benefit you. It may just slow you down. So then to kind of break down even further and kind of zone in on that 3 to 4 hour. So again, this is going to look like that performance plate that we talked about in previous sessions. High carbohydrate, moderate protein, low to moderate fat. Again, just wanting to give our stomach enough time to digest so that our muscles are energized enough, but we won't have as much, gastrointestinal upset or cramping, etc. And then to look what something may look like 1 to 2 hours before is again that carbohydrate based large snack and then some protein to kind of keep us sustained. Um, it should again be large, smaller than a meal, but larger than what you might be able to consume in that 30-minute, 60-minute window. These kinds of things would be ideal if you have, a hard morning training session and want to wake up adequately, with enough time to digest beforehand. So this could look anything like you see on the slides, like a smoothie with fruit, milk, yogurt, chia seeds, something that's, not just, you get your carbohydrates from the fruit, but you also get your protein from, the milk, yogurt, or chia seeds. Could look like a PB&J. It could look like, one of like a more hearty protein carbohydrate energy bar. So like Cliff or Go Macro bars. Or it could look like instant oatmeal because that's that quick carbohydrate. But also if you add in things like fruit, chia seeds, milk again, you'll get that small amount of protein that will kind of keep it more sustained. Then when we're looking at if it's, less than 60 minutes before, like I said, these are the ones that are going to want to have, really quick, easily digested snacks to top up those energy stores. So again, all six of these examples are primarily carbohydrates and primarily simple carbohydrates. Um, I a lot of these things too, like, you see, I have these listed as like the Rice Krispie treats, fruit snacks, goldfish. These are demonized as not healthy, but for athletes, these actually can be extremely supportive. I really want to share, like, don't fear the sugar. You require quick energy, aka sugar, during your practice and games and stuff to supply your muscles and brain with that fast fuel. So, for example, if you're right before a game, you want to not only get some carbohydrates and electrolytes, but, hydrate as well. Oftentimes people will refer or opt for a sports drink. And, nowadays we have the zero sugar ones and then we have the normal ones. So as an athlete, we're not going to really benefit from those zero sugar, zero calorie ones to actually fuel our performance. We really want to go for the the regular full sugar ones because that's actually what's going to support you. And I also too just want to say, like, don't compare your fueling strategy to your teammates. You may have a different position than your teammates. You might be the one that is running more, running faster, and you might need a little bit more energy where your teammate may just be kind of on that defense guarding situation, etc. Yes, Josh, I see you have your hand up. The
Didn't want to
question.
interrupt. You were on a roll, but
No,
just
it's okay.
quick question about the artificial sweeteners, and
Yep.
just generally speaking, is that like I get why you'd want the full sugar from a caloric intake and things like that, but beyond that, what's the conventional wisdom on whether they're reasonably good for you, not good for you? There's a lot of, I
There's
think,
a
sort
lot
of
of, yeah, there's a lot
urban
of,
myth, but also I think some scientific fact as well.
yeah, I mean, I think like the research is still kind of up in the air given that it's such like a newer thing that the long-term studies haven't been able to kind of be uh conducted yet for long-term effects on their like health implement outcomes. I think in moderation it's not really a bad thing. However, I mean, like, if I wouldn't, necessarily always suggest it as a replacement instead of, just real cane sugar, unless you have certain medical conditions that you need to, watch your sugar intake, etc. So it is kind of one of those up in the air. We're still waiting for those long-term results to come back, I guess. All right. So thank you for the question. So now we will move into that mid-workout fueling. So this is really going to kind of look very similar to that less than 60-minute fueling goals. Um, because you just want to kind of maintain your activity. And again, that's going to kind of depend on how long your activity is lasting. So if it's less than an hour, you may be okay to just fuel or hydrate with water. Maybe you need electrolytes if it's you're outside and it's very hot like today, or you're just someone who has a high sweat rate or it's humid or whatever. Um, if it gets to be a training or practice that's over an hour, that's when we want to start introducing those simple carbohydrates. Roughly 30 to 60 grams per hour of activity. And that's where those electrolytes are going to start to become, necessary. So if you have, a little timeout or break or just kind of a water break, maybe that's a time where you want to just put in a handful of dried fruit or that's where you opt for those full sugar sports drinks or a quick go-go squeeze applesauce of some sort, just to give you that little um, carbohydrate snack without, filling your stomach to the point where you're now going to cramp and, be weighed down. And then when we get to, a 3+ hour training, so, that may be a double header for some athletes or just a lift followed by a practice, followed by all those things that kind of will then extend. That's when we're going to want to up the simple carbohydrates even more to around 60 to 90 grams per hour. You may be able to kind of introduce a little bit more of those complex carbohydrates if you're able to tolerate that. And then depending on the event, again, if like maybe it's 3+ hours, but you have half-hour break in between, maybe you're going to want to introduce a small amount of protein and fat just to keep you kind of sustained. And again, electrolytes and water is going to be crucial during this time. And then post-workout bucket. So post-workout, I think we hear a lot, it's like protein, protein, protein. That's gonna repair, that's gonna restore, that's gonna do all the good things that we need post-workout. But it shouldn't just be protein. When we think of post-workout fueling, we like to think of, repleting those lost glycogen stores and the water that we lose through sweat. So glycogen, how is that repleted? Carbohydrates, and then obviously sweat or water loss is replenished with water and electrolytes. So post workout, I always say to remember the 3 R's. So refuel, repair, and rehydrate. So refuel is consuming a carbohydrate rich snack within 30 minutes to replenish those glycogen stores. So the glycogen stores that I've talked about in not only this session, but previous sessions, is that glucose that we store in our muscles. So that's what our body is gonna go for right at first when we start in our exercise. So when we don't have a full store of glycogen in our muscles, then we're kind of starting 10 steps back, at the beginning of our exercise rather than having that, fuel to set up. So that glycogen store has kind of a short amount of window in which that can be most effectively replenished post exercise. So that's why I say like consuming a carbohydrate rich snack within 30 minutes to effectively replenish those stores. That's going to be our main priority. And then when we say repair, we think protein. Still a really important part of post workout recovery. And this will likely be part of that, recovery meal. So a performance plate within an hour or two of your activity to rebuild that muscle and repair, all the muscle tears that you've done, through your activity. And then, of course, rehydrate, replacing sweat losses. That's not really a time frame. You want to do that throughout your whole recovery post-workout fueling time. Any questions? Or kind of break down. Next, we're going to break down post-recovery or post-workout feeling a little bit further. So eating within 15 to 60 minutes after for that replenishment of your glycogen stores is essential if you aren't able to have access to a full meal, within that time frame after workout. Totally makes sense. A lot of athletes, they either, they have a a meeting after a game or practice, and they don't necessarily are able to get to their meal within 60 minutes. So, and that's okay, but what we want to do instead is to prioritize having something available that is a carbohydrate focused, so that you can work to replenish that or start that recovery process. So that could be, again, whether it's you don't have time or access to have a full meal soon after, or you just, aren't hungry enough for a full meal, which is very common after high intensity activity, because, activity can deplete our appetite. However, it is still really important that we refuel very soon. And then within 1 to 2 hours after, this is when we're going to want to refuel with that complete meal. So including carbohydrates, protein, fruits and vegetables, fats, all the things that are going to make a complete balanced meal. And I want to note that you can go straight to a meal. It's not like you have to wait. Honestly, I would almost encourage that if that is available to you, to eat a big or a full balanced meal within 60 minutes of your training. I just, I always want to share how obviously I understand that it is not always feasible for this to happen. You're traveling, you have to run errands, I don't know, whatever it be. But having that snack, if you aren't able to get that meal, that makes sense. So breaking that more, what does a 15 to 60-minute snack look like? So again, we want to prioritize carbohydrates and then add protein if we can. So, this could be peanut butter crackers, cereal or granola, just something that's, stable at room temperature that you can have in your bag, so that it won't, go bad. Or, the gold, king recovery that a lot of sports dietitians will always talk about is chocolate milk. So why is chocolate milk is this like perfect source of recovery fuel, because of its carbohydrate to protein ratio and amounts, because we get carbohydrates from the added sugar with the chocolate milk, and then milk naturally containing the protein in it. So if you have access to chocolate milk, or even chocolate soy milk if you can't do dairy, it's pretty comparable in its proportions. And then 1 to 2 hours after, whether, and this could also again look like a full meal within that hour. Again, you're going to want to include carbohydrates, protein, color, and fats. So if it's, in the morning, it could look like a breakfast sandwich on a bagel with, eggs for protein, cheese for fats, turkey bacon, regular bacon for some more protein, tomato, avocado for, so for that color. It could look like a poke bowl. It could look like some kind of stir fry with all the veggies and proteins. So a performance plate doesn't have to look like a plate that has, its sections and such. It can look just like a normal meal, but making sure we're kind of looking through it somewhat like the sandwich. Okay, like there's a carb, there's bread, obviously the bagel. There's protein from the eggs and the bacon. There's cheese, which is their good fats, tomato. So you check all of those boxes off the performance plate, but it can look like, adapting to what, you like. Okay, I just got a question from David. What are good sources of plant-based proteins? That's a great question. Yes, because it does not have to always just be chicken, beef, all those things. So really good sources of plant-based proteins are going to be soy products. So edamame, tofu, tempeh, and then beans, legumes, lentils, all really good sources of protein. And then, I think if you're like vegetarian, but you could all or pescatarian, fish and all those things, fish, shellfish, salmon, whitefish. If you are someone that eats um, fish as a vegetarian, um, eggs as well. There are plant-based proteins that have, if you're someone that stays away from um, regular meat and they have meat substitutes, a lot of times they will have, soy within it that will be a good substitute. But if you're looking for those kind of whole food sources, my go-tos are always like tofu, beans, lentils, legumes, chickpeas, eggs, all those things. So, and I like to kind of break it down for like a visual of, what a day could potentially look like. So, and again, remembering that every athlete is different, your schedule is going to be different, and, your portion sizes may look different, but I like to kind of just show this as a, example of how, you can effectively fuel around a training that's in the morning. This one's, for example. So, if you take a look, there's this kind of pre-workout mini breakfast. You could wake up and even go back to bed after having this, but you're just like preparing your body for that fuel with something like a simple carbohydrate like a rice cake with some peanut butter to be able to kind of sustain and get your body ready for that 7 a.m. practice. That pre-workout with really simple carbohydrates that we talked about could look like just a handful of dried fruit. You're then sustained enough to be able to train from 7 to 9. That water may include electrolytes or some sort of simple carbohydrate snack as well. And then, come 9:30 or 10 even, that's when you're gonna, have that recovery meal. So in this example, it's a veggie omelet with, I'm assuming, cheese and bread and so all your different macronutrients. You can opt for a snack that's going to just be something simple, like a clementine. Then, a couple hours later, you're going to want to have lunch, again, an optional snack, dinner, and then again, an optional evening snack. But the biggest thing I want to point out here is how we're not going more than 2, 3, 4 hours without fueling with something. That's really important as an athlete to make sure we're consistently taking in nutrients, carbohydrates, protein throughout the day to keep our bodies at this sustained level of energy and recovery, especially if we, trained in the morning. We still have all day to refuel and recover. Say you have an afternoon practice around 3 to 5. What could your day look like? So you could wake up, have a full breakfast at 8 a.m. So I think this is, a bowl of oatmeal or something with, fruit and nuts and coconut. You could add some protein in there, make sure you're hydrated. 2 hours later, if you're hungry, maybe have some kind of protein snack. This example was hard-boiled eggs. And again, none of these are really rigid. I just like to kind of show these as an example of maybe what a timeline could look like based on your training. So, pointed out here is that lunch is 3 hours ahead of training. It's going to be a full meal. And then right before the training, we're going to have a simple carbohydrate snack. So I think those are like fig bars. So something easy to digest, full of carbohydrates that are going to energize that training. And then again, maintaining that recovery trend of a kind of schedule. Any questions about those two examples? No? So, key takeaways that I want you all to kind of leave with today. Why does fuel timing matter? Well, I mean, we want to maximize our training outcomes. We want to maintain our energy levels, not only, you know, throughout the day or throughout the training, but throughout the season. And then, you know, the main focus of before training is fueling with carbs and a little bit of protein, making sure you're aware of the timing. So if it's 3 to 4 hours before your training or game, you're going to want to have a full meal. If you're it's 30 to 60 minutes before, that's when we're going to just want to focus on carbohydrates. Always staying hydrated. The 3 R's after training, so refueling, repairing, and rehydrating. Carbs are going to be to replenish those glycogen stores and refuel our muscles. Protein to repair those muscles because we just worked them quite hard, and we need to be able to restore them. So thinking roughly 20 to 35 grams of protein at a meal, kind of at the minimum. Then of course fluid and electrolytes to rehydrate. And ultimately just remembering that consistency is like much better to focus on than perfection. So, you know, you might have something, you know, 3 to 4 hours ahead of time that's not maybe exactly a performance plate. You know, you missed a little of the carbohydrates or you missed a little bit of that fats, but you know, also then remembering these key takeaways, and then how can you then 30 to 60 minutes before you know, fill in those gaps with what you missed at that full meal ahead. You know, fueling just in general adequately is going to give that better performance and recovery. But then breaking it down further into remembering, you know, when, not just what to eat. Okay. Thank you for that and listening. Is there any questions from that presentation? And if not, you're always more than welcome to send me an email if there is anything that you would like clarified. My email is listed here. I'm going to stop the recording.
Hey, Olivia, it's Keith. Thanks again for
Hi,
another.